Hello. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are excited. Let us start with introductions. I'm Gaytree. This is my previous sign name, and this is my current sign name. Hello. My name is Natasha Backus, but I prefer to be called Courage. I'm happy to be conducting these interviews hosted by DNext Media. They're sponsoring these interviews of 2 to 3 participants. Today, we have 2 guests joining us to discuss. Yes, to share our perspectives. We appreciate you coming onto our program. This project has been made possible by DNext Accessible Media Lab at the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. We'd like to extend a big thank you to the Ontario Trillium Foundation for providing funding. Thank you for watching. We hope that you will continue the fight to break down barriers, bringing equity to our wonderful world. From Courage and I, we thank you. If we're ready, we'll start with Rohan. Thank you for coming, Rohan. Please tell us about yourself.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to be here. My name is Rohan Smith, and I work as a financial advisor. I'm from Toronto, Canada.
Thank you, Rohan. We're really pleased to have you here and very honored. Jaideep, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jaideep. This is my sign name. I live in Toronto, and I am a student at George Brown College. I originally hail from India. It's nice to see you again, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this interview.
We're very excited. Shall we get underway with some questions? Yes, I have a question for Jaideep. What colonialism have you faced while learning ASL from white teachers and from ASL materials that were authored by white deaf educators? How has this impacted you culturally, linguistically, and systemically?
Good question. I was born in India, which was under British rule and had been for quite some time. As a result, Indian citizens were colonized and still are to this day. This colonization meant that we behaved like white people. We all thought that was okay. When I moved to Toronto, I had not yet learned ASL. As I learned ASL, I was still unaware of my own colonized thoughts. About 3 or 4 years ago, I began to realize the extent that colonial influence had on me and ASL. It seems ASL has stolen signs from around the world, and tragically, this has worked against us. For example, the sign or graphic typically used for interpreter is used in India to represent a cultural dance called Madua, as expressive dance using the hands. I must wonder if that sign was taken and used for ASL. It's powerful to wonder how many people have been influenced by colonialism in their use of ASL.
Thank you, Jaideep. The point you make about the sign Madua in relation to Indian Sign Language is very interesting. I'd like to pose the same question to Rohan.
I neglected to mention in my earlier introduction that I was born in Jamaica, which has clearly been colonized. I did attend a school for the deaf when I was a child. And I recall that all deaf students at that time were expected to learn in an oral setting, an environment where English was highly valued above signed languages. Our own Jamaican Sign Language became tied to British influences as well, as Jamaica was under British rule. At a later point in time, missionaries from America began to teach ASL, and I remember very clearly how desperate I was to learn ASL, to be able to master both English and ASL. Over time, our own Jamaican Sign Language began to fade away. When I look back on its erasure, it's clear to see the effects of colonization. Now, Jamaican Sign Language. I love most languages. They fascinate me as they apply to our own experiences. When the missionaries came to Jamaica, they shared their language without understanding our experience, and that is the problem we have. Years later, when I visited Jamaica, I saw that deaf Jamaicans were rejecting ASL in favor of their own native sign language, JSL. When I see deaf Jamaicans now and we don't understand each other, that's a good thing. When I came to Canada, it was a culture shock, big time. My cultural norms and behaviors from Jamaica were incongruent with the peers I was with, the majority of whom were white. There were very few black people, so I had to adapt to learn their behavior, their way of thinking, and their culture, and slowly lost my own. It's like being faced with a wall of armed soldiers. You have no choice. You fall in line with their rules and their norms. That's how I see it. Perhaps the effects of colonialism are positive, and perhaps they are negative. Identity is an integral part of your life, something to share with future generations. It is something to value, to give us strength to move forward and on with life.
Yes, I agree that JSL should be cherished. That's nice to know. Thank you for sharing. Gaytree will be asking our next question. Yes, I'd like to ask you both how you confront racism when it happens to you and why you chose to share this specific story. Rohan, why don't you start?
During my time at Gallaudet, I experienced significant racism. In Jamaica, we had some awareness around the treatment of, but in Jamaica, we never talk about racism. It just wasn't discussed. We treated each other as equals. Our teachers were black. It was more about hearing versus deaf. We were black. Everyone was black. However, when I moved to Canada, I noticed a big difference. I came up against many jokes using terms like Negro, and at that time I didn't fully understand what racism meant. That realization came years later. I assumed that it was the Canadian culture and that was acceptable. Canadians welcomed me warmly and were never explicitly racist. Instead, racist terms or comments were made in a veiled, joking manner. Now, at Gallaudet, I faced overt racism. Many comments were made about black people and about Jamaican culture. Let me give you one example of a racist experience I faced. Truly, I have countless examples, but I'll share this one as I feel it's important. This happened with a person I know very well. Of course, I won't name them. This person was reading a newspaper one day. Are you familiar with the Washington Post? The paper reported murders every day in the Washington area. 400 murders had taken place in that year. The person I knew followed the stories, keeping track of how many people were killed. Many black people lived in the area, and a high percentage of the gun violence victims were black. This person, while counting the murders in the paper, one day exclaimed, "4 died today, yay!" They were celebrating the murders of black people. That comment pierced right through me. That was my experience every day with overt racism. At Gallaudet, the racism was blatant, including in their behavior. The narrative on campus was that black people had flashy cars, even though their houses were falling apart. They would laugh and mock us. This was the kind of behavior I saw every single day. The behavior was appalling. I knew those type of people would never stop, so I completed my studies, took my degree, and ran. That's why I am where I am now, in Canada.
Wow, that is certainly a lot to go through. You are a brave man to have made your way through that and become the success that you are. Now, Jaideep, if you could answer the same question.
Racism wasn't a word I was familiar with while I was living in India. The people there are still very much colonized by the British. In India, skin tones range widely from light to dark. People with dark skin aren't permitted to marry those with light skin because they're looked down on. I wasn't bothered by that, perhaps because I had been colonized so deeply. When I came to Canada, I was still unaware of the effects colonization had on me, until one white person called me Paki. I was taken aback and explained that I'm not from Pakistan, I'm from India, and how can you call me that? In response, he said, "All brown people are shit." That experience, and others like it, are how I discovered racism and discrimination here in Canada, just as they are in India. These days, I've learned to face racism with advocacy and awareness within the Indian deaf community. LGBTQ people also suffer discrimination in India. They are shunned from society. Even in their own LGBTQ community, those with darker skin are considered inferior. It's a sad situation. I'm trying to spread awareness to stop this. We are all human beings, and we are trapped in the effects of colonization. I wish we could just decolonize.
Jaideep, I can relate to your story. Growing up in Canada, I wasn't aware of racism until I grew older. I began to feel uneasy and recognize the effects of colonization in myself. Because I had grown up in a school for the deaf where the majority of people were white, I saw how easily I had been influenced. I found your story very relatable. Thank you, Jaideep. You too are a brave man. Courage, did you want to ask our next question? Thank you both for sharing. Your stories gave me the chills. Racism is still very present today, sadly. We hope for equality and an end to racism. Don't you agree? I have another question for Jaideep. How have you assessed and unpacked the effects of colonization on yourself and the systems here in Canada? Do you have an example you could share with us? Thank you, Jaideep.
Sure. 4 years ago, when that person called me Packy, I looked within myself to see why I had been influenced by colonization. It's likely because India was under British rule and still subscribes to a British system, a white system, to this day. I examined Canada and recognized that every system in Canada was established by white people. The cultures and ethnicity of others had no bearing on how Canada's systems were established. Instead, the system was made by white people for white people. That led me to consider how Canada has rejected Indigenous peoples. I feel a connection with Indigenous people, and I'm always honored to meet Indigenous people because this is their land. Often white people tell us to go back to where you come from. But truly, all white people come from immigrants.
Thank you, Jaideep. I agree. It's crucial that we look within ourselves to find and remove the effects of colonization. I relate to being bullied and made fun of, and I realize that that stems from a system that serves white people. That same system that stripped Indigenous people of their land. Now, I'd like to pose the same question to Rohan, please. Thank you.
Well, I moved from Jamaica to Canada 40 years ago. Something that I was perplexed by was when I arrived in Canada, my first roommate was a black person. Right away, I began comparing their life as a black person who was born in Canada to my own. After graduation, I realized why our lives were so different. I considered another black person who had already graduated, and even a third person. They were very popular amongst white people. They were well liked and respected. Things were very different 40 years ago. Racism at that time was more subtle, whereas today it's much more visible. We may have been more accepted 40 years ago, but that is only because we mimicked the behavior of white people, which is clearly an effect of colonization. After graduation, I learned from my roommate that many fellow students from deaf schools didn't like me because they viewed me as different. Of course I was different. I was born in Jamaica. Jamaican culture was inherently part of me, and it is different than Canadian culture. I challenged those who saw me as different, though through my involvement in sports, school, and my studies. When I compare myself with those two popular black people, I can't say for certain, but colonization can have various outcomes. If we accept and live by colonized standards, we may be better accepted by white people. That's what I witnessed in the popularity of my black roommate, who is still very well liked today.
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting that white people thought so highly of a black person because of their colonized behavior. Thank you for sharing. Gaytree? Yes, I see the difference. Just as BIPOC are colonized too, made to think that lighter shades of brown are better than darker shades. Taught to believe that lighter-skinned people have more opportunities than their darker-skinned counterparts. As a light-skinned person, I admit that I have a little more privilege. But I still navigate racism and colonialism, and it's challenging. I see the difference between those who are colonized and those who have broken free from that. We'll talk more about that shortly. Yes. Now I'd like us to focus on white allies. Yes, it's a tricky question. Rohan, I'd like to ask you this question. When a white ally says, I get it, as a white ally, I get it. If so, what is your perspective when a white ally says, I get it? Is it enough?
That's a very good question. I don't represent all Black or BIPOC people. I can only speak for myself and my perspective. You know, a high percentage of my clients are white, and they keep my business running now. I can't discuss that. When I first opened my business, I faced a lot of rejection, and I had a very small percentage of white allies become my clients. When white allies say, I get it, or become defensive, they shouldn't. They should demonstrate that through their actions.
Agreed.
It's that simple. Do not say that. We must use our own judgment when choosing who to befriend, typically those who have demonstrated it through actions. For example, in Jamaica, when I invite friends over, we eat together, we hang out, and we don't have to mention race. It doesn't need to be discussed. We can just get on with life. That's my perspective. White allies should not say that, period. Unless they're protecting Black people. Yes, but as an individual, they should not, period.
Yes, that's a powerful statement. Act. Don't say, I get it. I agree with you. Jaideep, same question.
I must say I agree with Rohan 100%. I've lost some allies because they were saying, I get it. I had to ask them, where are your actions? Actions speak louder than words. They lacked understanding of Indian culture. Indian culture can be overly sensitive. We have strong values and we care. Sometimes too much. Allies should understand, but they point to Bollywood films as something they love about Indian culture. Bollywood films, and they should go to India and not just for a holiday. India is a rich experience. Oh my God, India has more than 35 languages, incredible cuisines, and cultures unlike Canada. That's how I lost some of my white friends. They weren't interested in me. They were fussy, not only about India, but about Guyana and other countries in Africa. They should be accepting and inclusive. I would prefer that. And why not? If they're not able to do that, then they just don't understand, and they need to take a closer look at themselves. They're blind to white privilege, and they need to fix that.
Thank you, Jaideep. Yes, I agree. Many white people don't understand that the words, I get it, is not enough. Be willing to take action. Open your heart. Open your mind. Get involved without saying anything. Just talking will not make a difference. Yes, I've been taking in your stories, and you're right. Actions speak louder than words. It's important, of course. I've had people tell me they get it. No. Come visit my country, Guyana. There is always white privilege, always. I encourage those who benefit from white privilege to examine themselves because they're accustomed to colonial ideas. They were raised and influenced by those notions at home. It's crucial that parents take the responsibility of opening their children's eyes, minds, and hearts by involving their children in diversity. Through different cultures and languages, the words get it shouldn't be used in this context. I have a question for Rohan next. ASL books and literature are predominantly written by white people. We don't have books or literature from Black deaf people, and there is a difference between white ASL and Black ASL. What are your thoughts, Rohan?
Okay, I'll answer that question, but first, I must say that I never paid much attention to the ASL Dictionary of Canada. It's not my thing. I did, however, take a course at Gallaudet called Introduction to ASL, and it was quite extensive. ASL courses are not my thing because I wasn't born in Canada, and I don't know what it's like to grow up here. I don't have that fascination with it, although I am proud of my language because I've been using it for many years now. I haven't seen it. If white people are willing to be involved, or black people could collaborate to specifically showcase black ASL, that may intrigue me. Otherwise, I compare it to English. When I'm reading English, I don't find myself interested in the vocabulary or the structure. English can be complex or simple, and ASL is similar in that way. What's important is that I can express myself both in ASL and written English. Someone's fluency in ASL can certainly affect how you live among white people. Lack of fluency in ASL can cause further marginalization. Oh yes, so fluency in ASL is very important for black people, unfortunately. I feel that ASL fluency is imperative to socializing and living well in Canada in white society. I'm not saying that I'm against that. I'm proud that I'm able to use ASL, but to be completely honest with you, I'm not interested in ASL dictionaries. Hopefully, in years to come, we will see more Black deaf resources being developed. I was not born in Canada, but I'd like to see resources created by Black deaf Canadians. Little by little, with the support of our white allies, we will see the results of that action. Talk is just that. It's nothing without action. I would like to add to our earlier conversation about I get it. I remember my family hosting a white couple at our home in Jamaica. This couple didn't care what background they came from, if they were rich or if they were poor. We all just crashed on the floor or on our couch. They enjoyed our traditional foods, customs, and our country. I think about this experience when I think about developing ASL resources for Black deaf Canadians. Having Black deaf ASL and LSQ users, whatever their background is, to come together. We could secure government funding to support this initiative, and why shouldn't we?
Thank you, Rohan. I appreciate you sharing your raw comments. Now I'll turn it over to Jaideep to answer the same question.
I didn't learn ASL in any formal educational classes in Canada. I just learned ASL by hanging around with friends. From 2002 to about 3 or 4 years ago, I thought ASL was a cool language. And then the Black Lives Matter movement happened. BLM caused me to look at ASL more critically and see that ASL was created by white people. Without the inclusion or input of IBPOC people, without respect for their preferred signs, for their homelands. Take, for example, the 2 signs used for Native or Indigenous. The ASL sign, F from chin to ear, originates from Indigenous people's history with hunting. When an animal was killed, the hunter would take the blood and wipe this through their hair. The sign comes from the idea that Native people were foul-smelling because of the animal blood in their hair. That is highly racist. I guarantee that ASL has a high percentage of racist signs. When I was in India, I had some friends who had graduated from Gallaudet University and were using ASL in India. This offended other deaf Indian people, as ASL is not their native signed language. It is ISL. The government has officially recognized ISL, which is wonderful. I think it's time to remove some signs from the ASL vocabulary in favor of signs that respect diverse cultures. For example, I prefer the sign for India with the thumb than this sign, please. The sign for Africa has also changed, causing confusion. I checked YouTube, or perhaps it was Facebook, and found one black man who traveled to Africa and discussed this new sign. He noted that the old sign includes the ASL hand shape for A, which concerned him. On the other hand, some people in Africa still valued old sign. ASL causes people to lose their identity.
Yes, as a deaf Black woman, I use ASL despite its colonial influences. I've always wished that I knew my own people's sign language. I agree with Rohan's point around collaborating with other deaf Black people to create our own language. Thank you for sharing, Jaideep. Gayatri has our next question. Yes, Rohan and Jaideep, this is the reason that I changed my sign name. My original sign name was given to me by a white person, but it doesn't represent who I am. My good friend Jaideep gave me a beautiful new sign name. My new sign name represents my friendly disposition and my round cheeks. Now for our last question. I'd like to ask you both what mistakes you commonly see from our white allies in their advocacy work. If you could share one example or more if possible, Rohan.
This one is a tough question. I think we can look at two groups. Survivors, in other words, deaf people, who must advocate and push for the government to provide for all regardless of race, which is challenging. But to survive as a deaf Black person, we must collaborate with the majority deaf community. To access government funding that is granted to all of us, then we must advocate together in order to get what we need as taxpayers. But to gain our support, again, it is imperative to respect individuals of color. We, the deaf community, must work harder if we want to succeed. The deaf community must look within and examine who has the most support, Black IBPOC. Without the support of Black people, or IBPOC, it's difficult for white people to lobby the government. I've seen that frequently. For example, there was a group of people fighting for education, and the IBPOC community were hesitant to offer their support because they felt they hadn't received enough support from white people in the past. Why should they join their cause and fight to further us again? Which means that first, we solve indifferences between us. Then together, we can do better to advocate for all of us. It's all about equality. It's about respecting each other. It's not about judgment. With a respectful, non-judgmental approach, I think we can have equitable treatment. We can achieve a more equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's very tough to answer this question. Thank you for trying to share so openly. It's very raw. I see this so commonly among white allies. I'm feeling a little emotional. This discussion is triggering for me as I admit that I've lost some friends in the past because my friends wouldn't accept the fact that they had made mistakes when I brought it to their attention. It's very tough. Jaideep, same question for you.
Would you please repeat the question? Thank you.
No problem. What common mistakes do you see in our white allies' efforts in advocating for us?
Our allies are human too, of course. After BLM, I noticed a big increase in support from white people who wanted to show support for their friends of diverse backgrounds, which is wonderful, and thank you. At the same time, many of them were asking me or my friends from other ethnic backgrounds for redundant information. In the end, I felt we were sharing so much, providing so much in education, in storytelling, and do they get it? Do they actually get it? I feel they need to accept the onus of seeking information for themselves. Use Google. The internet has countless resources to use in educating yourself. If you're genuinely interested in learning, you can do so. Just as Gayatri said earlier, some won't accept that fact. Often there's a denial about their wrongdoings, but their behavior from the past was disrespectful towards us. There has been a stark difference between prior to and after BLM, and that's how we've lost some of our white allies in the past. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing straight from the heart. It's a little emotional. We open our lives up to our white allies, allowing them in, and there's a risk that they could hurt us. It's a tricky situation. We'll be wrapping up shortly. I'd like to add something regarding white allies. I take a lot of risk in code switching. I've witnessed mistakes made by our allies and wondered whether I should call them on it. After some self-reflection, I've decided to start calling them on it. Perhaps they don't understand or aren't aware of their own colonized behavior. When we call them on it, we may get through to them. Get them to take stock of themselves and apologize for their mistake. Apologies can be hard to accept. I will accept an apology once, not multiple times. Now to wrap up, I'd like to thank Jaideep and Rohan for your heartfelt, raw answers to our questions. It was inspiring. Thank you for sharing. This project will make a difference by showcasing various perspectives, which is incredible. Thank you again for sharing. I'm glad we were able to break down some barriers today through your unfiltered commentary. You've helped us to make a difference, which is important, by sharing with our audience. Our project is through DNext Accessible Media. Yes, we'd like to thank the Ontario Trillium Foundation for providing funding for us to continue our work on this project. We're touched. We must keep fighting. We are the change. We will unite and we won't give up. Our children are our future. We must teach them to become leaders for the future. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Rohan and Jaideep, for your time and sharing your raw comments. I feel so emotional. To know that you are both leading us towards making a difference for our IBPOC family